Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Philosophossum, and if you've been following my channel, you'll probably recall from 2 videos ago I mentioned that Thom Hartmann doesn't know anything about libertarianism, like at all. Well, it turns out it's actually worse than that. See, not only is it the case that Thom Hartmann doesn't understand libertarianism, but he actually goes out of his way to misrepresent it. Like, passively not understanding something is one thing, but actively going out of your way to purposefully misrepresent something is totally something else. And as you'll see in this video, that's exactly what Thom Hartmann does, as he tries to make the claim that libertarians are racist. And it's not even that he's arguing that libertarians tend to be racist. No, he's full on coming out and saying that libertarianism as an ideology is fundamentally racist.
Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, you know the guy who questioned the wisdom of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 when he was first running for office?
Someone's automatically racist because they just so happen to criticize the Civil Rights Act. Okay, I see, we're playing that game. Well, first you'll have to mention which part of the Civil Rights Act is being criticized, then we'll talk. You see, the Civil Rights Act is a bit of a complex piece of legislation. It's not just a singular law that does a singular thing. It's actually a series of laws that do a multitude of things. Abolishing Jim Crow laws, extending voting rights to African Americans, penalizing certain forms of discrimination. Because the Civil Rights Act is a bit complex in its scope and what it actually does, it's not really accurate to speak of being for or against it wholesale. Like, it's possible that someone might be in favor of certain aspects of the Civil Rights Act, but also against other aspects of it. Like, there's aspects of the Civil Rights Act I agree with, and there's aspects of it I disagree with. The issue's a bit more complicated than someone offers a criticism against the Civil Rights Act, therefore they must be against it.
Finds himself at the center of yet another race-related controversy this week.
Well, let's be honest, when you're a hardcore left-winger, everything's a race-related issue. Like, do you guys remember back when the left tried making a race issue out of a Corn Pops box? I might do a video covering this actually because it's kind of funny in how ridiculous it is, but a while back Corn Pops had a box with some artwork on the back depicting some anthropomorphic Corn Pops at a shopping mall, and the Corn Pop who was supposed to be the janitor had a slightly darker shade of color than all the others, and they tried making this out to be racism or some shit like that. Like Kellogg's cereal was somehow engaging in racial bigotry through subliminal messaging or some shit.
Yesterday, the Washington Free Beacon published an article titled Rebel Yell, which detailed the previous career of Rand Paul's right-hand man, a guy by the name of Jack Hunter. He co-authored Rand Paul's first book.
So in the process of doing research for this video, I of course wanted to verify the accuracy of the sources that he's using, so I did a little bit of research on the Washington Free Beacon, and almost immediately something came to my attention which kind of raised a red flag. This is not an unbiased news organization. Not only do they have a very clear and distinct conservative bias, but they get pretty much all their backing from one wealthy individual. Now, of course, this doesn't prima facie invalidate everything they have to say. Even biased organizations can still publish accurate and reliable data, but it does mean we should approach this with a heightened level of scrutiny.
While working as a radio host in South Carolina, Hunter apparently appeared in public wearing a Confederate flag mask.
Okay, and? Like, what sort of point are you trying to get across here by mentioning that he was wearing a Confederate flag mask? Or let me guess, you're one of those brainlets who thinks that the Confederate flag mask represents racism or slavery or some shit like that.
Openly called for secession.
Okay, and what's the problem with that? He just thinks that southern communities should be free to govern themselves. I don't see what's so sinister about that. You know, one thing I never understood is that the South wanting to secede and be independent from the Union is always portrayed as a bad thing, but the original 13 colonies wanting to secede from England and be independent is somehow a good thing.
And defended the assassination of Abraham Lincoln.
So here's the thing, I'll never defend a person's murder, ever, at all. As a libertarian, I support voluntary and peaceful means of obtaining the changes that I want. That being said, Lincoln was kind of a dick. You see, the version of Lincoln you're all taught in school, the hero who fought to save the Union and end slavery, isn't quite the version of Lincoln that history actually shows. Now, I could probably dedicate an entire hour-long video just to discussing the history of how Honest Abe was more like Dishonest Douche, but to give you a quick summarization, not only did he violate the Constitution more than any other president, there's at least 6 different amendments he violated in one way or another, but he also wasn't all that anti-slavery. You see, not only did Lincoln own slaves himself, but certain northern states that were sympathetic to Union interests got a nifty little exception to his slavery ban. Put simply, Booth didn't kill this guy for the hell of it.
This is Rand Paul's wingman, right? He called himself the Southern Avenger. He was a chairman of the Charleston wing of the League of the South, a group which, according to its own website, quote, advocates the secession and subsequent independence of the Southern states from this forced union.
So Tom, let me ask you a question real quick. As a matter of fact, this question goes out to anyone who supports Lincoln and his mission to preserve the Union. So Tom, you very clearly have a problem with slavery, which is fine, I do as well. I would hope most sane, rational people would. So since you're against slavery, you very clearly understand why it is that forced association is problematic. So if a slave owner doesn't have the right to force slaves to associate with him against their will, what gave Lincoln the right to force people in the South to associate with him against their will? Because here's the thing, Tom, I'm also against slavery, but I'm consistently against slavery. I'm wholesale against any and all forced association whatsoever. And I personally do support Southern secession, not because I sympathize with the cause of preserving slavery, but because I think all forced association is illegitimate, whether it be forcing a slave to associate with a master against his will, or forcing the South to associate with the Union against their will. Like, sorry Tom, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't just be against forced association, but carve out a nifty little exception when it's convenient for your political agenda.
And the formation of a Southern Republic.
Yeah, and this is pretty much the extent to which Thom Hartmann has researched the League of the South. I actually did quite a bit of research on the League of the South. I found it somewhat interesting that all these years after the Civil War, there's still quite a bit of support out there for Southern secession. Truth be told, it piqued my curiosity. I wanted to learn more about this organization. So I did some research looking around their website. The organization really isn't all that racist. The platform that their organization stands on mostly just revolves around Southern independence and supporting the interests of Southern people, which of course includes everyone in the South, white and black people. If you live in the South, whether you're white, black, Hispanic, Asian, they support your interests. As a matter of fact, according to the very Washington Free Beacon article that Tom cites, the League of the South is not considered a hate group and does not discriminate on membership. So presumably black people could sign up to be a member just as much as any white person. Now maybe there is some evidence somewhere out there that suggests that this group is racist, but I'm just not seeing it.
Right. Rand Paul is trying to now separate himself from Hunter. That's going to be kind of hard because the Southern Avenger isn't just some random staffer on his Senate staff. He's a good buddy of Rand Paul's. He helped him write his first book, The Tea Party Goes to Washington, back in 2010. So it now looks like Senator Paul is continuing in a great family tradition. I mean, even though he denies responsibility, his father, Ron Paul, published a series of racist newsletters during a 1996 congressional campaign.
So first of all, with regards to the racist quotes from Ron Paul's newsletter back in '96, not only were a lot of those quotes taken out of their original context, but it's not actually confirmed whether or not those quotes actually came from Ron himself as opposed to someone else on his campaign staff. But second of all, this is basically a guilt by association argument. He's basically trying to make Rand Paul look bad by criticizing people who associate with him as opposed to Rand himself. Yeah, just because Rand Paul has a racist father or a racist person on his campaign staff doesn't make him racist. Even if we were to just take for granted that Ron Paul and Jack Hunter are both these die-hard, skinhead, white supremacist Klan members, that still doesn't give us a shred of evidence as to whether or not Rand himself is racist. As a matter of fact, Tom himself even argues that Rand is trying to distance himself from these people. If Rand is trying to distance himself from the people who hold these views, there's a good chance that he doesn't approve of them.
And we really shouldn't be all that surprised by either Ron or Rand Paul's connection to far-right racism, and that's because they're libertarians.
What? What the fuck?
Did you hear that, fellas? I guess we get to automatically assume that someone's connected to far-right racism just because they're libertarian. Like, this has to be one of the most brain-lit things I've ever heard anyone say about libertarianism. Well, first of all, this is incredibly disingenuous to just, paint everyone who holds a particular ideology as racist. Like, he's just coming out and saying, yeah, all libertarians are racist. If you're libertarian, you're a racist. Yeah, that's right, fellas. If you believe that people should be left alone so long as they're not hurting anyone else and that individual rights are important, I guess that makes you a racist. somehow. Now, I'm sure there are racist libertarians out there. I mean, there are so many libertarians after all. Statistically speaking, odds are that at least one of them is going to be racist. I'm sure there is at least one racist in every political group, but it's not even like he's arguing that most libertarians are racist or that libertarians tend to be racist. What he's essentially arguing is that there's something fundamentally racist about libertarianism which necessitates that anybody who is a libertarian must be racist, which is incredibly intellectually dishonest. And he also tries to draw a connection between libertarianism and the far right, which of course when you're an uber leftist moron like Thom Hartmann, literally anyone who disagrees with you is far right. Like, I believe there should be a government-run healthcare program, but also believe that people should be able to purchase private insurance if they so prefer. You're practically Mussolini.
And libertarianism is the velvet glove over the iron fist of racism.
Hey pal, you just blowing from Stupid Town?
Let me stop you right there, Tom. Through your uber-leftist lens with which you see the entire world, libertarianism might seem like it's racist. In reality, libertarianism is actually the most non-racist thing there is. You see, the non-aggression principle, that is the ethical principle that all libertarianism is based on, which is something Thom Hartmann here would know if he actually bothered to do any research on libertarianism, which he's made abundantly clear at this point he hasn't. But the non-aggression principle simply states that it's wrong to initiate violence against innocent people. It doesn't specify whites, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, whatever, it just says people. The non-aggression principle, any libertarian conception of ethics and rights, applies to everybody. This is because the axiom of self-ownership, which is something that all libertarian ethics is based upon, comes as a result of being self-aware, which everyone of every race is. As a matter of fact, the non-aggression principle technically applies to anything sentient and self-aware, so even dolphins and orangutans are potential candidates for the non-aggression principle.
Here's how it works. When you have an entrenched racial and economic class that has ruled a continent for 5 centuries, they have well established the levers and the levels of power and wealth.
So there's a tendency among left-wingers to blame libertarianism for things that actually have nothing to do with libertarianism. It's true that most of the recent history of the Americas has been centered around white domination, but if you recall from a moment ago, I mentioned that the core principle of libertarianism is the non-aggression principle, the idea that people should be left alone as long as they're not hurting anybody. Well, if you look at the history of how white people came to dominate this continent, you'll see that this isn't exactly what the white explorers who conquered this country had in mind. Kicking people off their land, enslaving people. I'm pretty sure these would count as things that libertarians would be against. So while it's true that white people have ruled this continent for the past 500 years and established the levels of power, this has absolutely nothing to do with libertarianism. Like, not even close.
And they will, and do, generation after generation, do whatever is necessary to hang on to that wealth and power.
You are correct, sir!
This is actually correct. A group, once in power, will tend to have a difficult time parting with it, and will in fact do whatever they can to hold on to it, including going to the government and begging them to help them hold on to their power. If you look at how exactly it is that the power of elite groups has been held in place over history, a lot of it involves the government. Now, of course, the worst of this is a thing of the past. Things like Jim Crow laws and mandatory segregation are a thing no more, thank goodness. But we still have things like minimum wage and other sort of red tape, which are primary examples of things that the government implements to act as a shield for the elites and to prevent the lower classes from moving up in life.
History shows us this. I mean, you know, the history of Reconstruction, the whole history of integration in the 50s and 60s, that the only thing strong enough to challenge the political and economic power of a multi-century hereditary ruling class, particularly one based on race, is the power of government.
It's false.
Well, actually, if you look at the actual history of Reconstruction and integration in the South, you'll find that people were dealing with this political and economic power of the multi-century hereditary ruling class, to use his own words, just fine on their own. Businesses that refused to serve black people were being outcompeted by other businesses that did. The power of government wasn't really needed. As a matter of fact, contrary to what Tom is saying, the power of government is not the only thing that can challenge the authority of the ruling elite, but is the only thing that can actually prop it up. You see, the racist business owners in the South weren't particularly happy about being outcompeted by their non-prejudiced counterparts. So they did what any business owner does when they're afraid of their competition: went to the government. These racist business owners were able to find legislators who were sympathetic with their prejudiced viewpoints, and basically got them to pass laws that restricted their competition from serving black people as well, thus beginning the Jim Crow era in the South. So far from being the remedy to white supremacy in the South, government is actually the very thing that propped it up.
It was government that made Alabama Governor George Wallace and Georgia Governor Lester Maddox integrate their states. It was government that both passed and made the South finally accept the 14th and 15th Amendments.
Notice how he's speaking of government as a monolith? Like he's not specifying which level of government specifically, just government. The reason this is problematic is because it creates confusion by not accurately framing the issue. You see, the dispute over the Civil Rights Act wasn't necessarily between government and the private sector, as I've mentioned before. Most of the civil rights dispute actually took place between federal government and the state governments. You see, the state governments thought that they had the right to mandate segregation within their state, and the federal government was trying to restrict them from being able to do that. It wasn't necessarily between the government and private businesses. Most private businesses were happy to serve black people in the absence of the Jim Crow laws, and this is why it's inaccurate for him to frame it as government versus anyone else, because most of the disagreement was taking place internally within different levels of government. And notice how all the examples he gives of the federal government coming in to solve racism, it's always against things being done by state governments, not private companies. I have a hunch that Thom Hartmann is aware that Southern segregation was more of a government than a private sector related issue, and he's intentionally describing it with obscure language to try and dance around that.
Here's George Wallace in his inaugural address as governor of Alabama back in 1963.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
He was talking about was government, right? Federal government.
So yeah, what Governor Wallace was calling for in that video was state-mandated segregation. That is, he was advocating for what was the norm across the South, which was state governments telling private businesses they're not allowed to serve black people. This is something that no libertarian anywhere would support, like, at all.
Bitch, are you dumb, dum 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 dum.
But Wallace lost that fight because the power of government, when appropriately used, is greater than the power of wealth, class, or race.
Well, actually, the power of government is the power of wealth, class, and race. Like, most politicians are white rich people who serve the interests of white rich people. Just because the government did one good thing for black people in the 60s doesn't somehow make them the guardian angel of black people.
It took government to break the stranglehold of white rule in the 1870s and 1880s.
I've already explained why this is wrong, so we'll just move along.
But even that white power structure reasserted itself and fought to reclaim its power, leading to Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which set up a half century or more of segregation, legal apartheid right here in the United States, which kept into place the political and economic privileges of white people.
So Plessy versus Ferguson was actually in regards to state regulations which mandated that railroad companies had to have separate passenger cars for white and black passengers. So again, this is an issue that had to do with state governments and nothing to do with the private sector.
So now along comes a political philosophy, libertarianism, that says everything is fine, everything's equal, the government should just get the hell out of the way.
Mr. Strawman, give me a break.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's true that we think the government should leave people alone and get out of the way, but that's not necessarily because we think everything's all hunky-dory and that there's no problems out there that need to be addressed. It's because we don't see it as the magic solution to all of life's problems the way that you do. Of course, there are plenty of problems out there in society that need to be addressed. Nobody's denying that. The disagreement lies in how do we best address those problems, and, well, centralization has a bad track record, at least when compared to free market solutions.
They say this when the median net worth of a white family in the United States is $110,700, and that of a black family is $4,000.
Sure, it's true that black households on average earn less income than white households, but that's due to a variety of factors, not necessarily racism. What I can tell you is that your precious government you love so much isn't exactly helping with that matter. Because of things like property taxes and restriction of school choice, black kids are often stuck going to inferior schools, and therefore are on average less educated than white people. Because of this, there's less career opportunities for them when they grow up. And this isn't exactly helped by things like minimum wage, which has been proven to disemploy black people more than whites.
They say this when in the entire history of the U.S. Senate, there have only been 3 African Americans elected to that body. They say this when just 20 minutes after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the biggest and most populous state of the old Confederacy, Texas, immediately put into place discriminatory voter suppression laws and began gerrymandering.
I like how he tries to make the point that libertarians are racist by pointing out racist things being done by government. Yeah, the racial employment diversity of government organizations are complete ass when compared to the private sector. Thanks for making our point, buddy.
So in effect, when conservatives and libertarians say government should get out of the way, what they're really saying is, let's lock into place white political power, white wealth, and white privilege.
No, actually. Our argument is that the government getting out of the way is the best way to challenge white political power, because the history shows that most of the time it's the government who's locking in place white political power and white privilege.
Of course, not all libertarians think of themselves as racist.
Actually, most libertarians don't think of themselves as racist because there's nothing racist about libertarianism, like, at all. And the fact that you had to either twist or omit so much historical information in this video to try and paint libertarianism as racist, more or less kind of proves that.
And most probably don't see how they're get rid of government policies.
So you're making the common mistake of conflating libertarianism and anarchism. Just because I want the government to leave me alone and mind its own business doesn't necessarily mean I don't want there to be a government at all.
Prop up institutional bigotry.
I've proven multiple times in this video that the only thing that props up institutional bigotry is the government, and that the best thing that challenges it is the free market.
But the reality is that when you blast government as the root of all evil, when you neuter its power...
This is another straw man, Tom. We don't necessarily believe that the government is the root of all evil, or even necessarily want to neuter its power. We just don't think that the government is the best means to solve every single one of society's problems.
You end up weakening the only thing that can keep the ruling elite, a racial ruling elite, in check.
You know, this is actually kind of racist what he's saying right here. I mean, if you think about it, what he's essentially saying is that black people are these poor, helpless weaklings who need daddy government to come in and babysit them. Whereas I see black people as strong, independent, rational adults capable of overcoming challenges in their lives just as much as any white person.
And when you do that, the rich and powerful race hangs on to their wealth and power, and the poorer minorities lose even more of what little they have.
Well, first of all, this is more racist bullshit. Like, I don't know what it is with the left and their obsession with all black people being poor, but this idea that the government stepping out of the economy somehow creates more poverty is also hogwash. Not only are things like poverty and wealth inequality actually lower in more economically free countries, as you'll see from the Index of Economic Freedom, but the poor and wealthier countries also have a pretty good quality of life. I mean, poor people in our country have shit that wealthy people in other countries don't have.
You know, in the end, it really doesn't matter whether Rand Paul agrees with Jack Hunter that the Confederacy was a good idea. He's trying to say,
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't matter whether or not he supported the Confederacy, because there's nothing necessarily racist about supporting the Confederacy. You see, if you look at the actual history of Southern secession, there were actually a whole multitude of reasons that Southern states wanted to secede from the Union. A lot of them had nothing to do with slavery or racism.
Because by going on and on about states' rights...
So one thing you should know about Thom Hartmann is that this guy literally thinks libertarians and conservatives are the same. And that's not me trying to strawman or stipulate. He's on record having said multiple times, quote, "Libertarians are Republicans who want to smoke dope and get laid." But anyway, states' rights is largely something that conservatives tend to make a fuss about. I mean, libertarians are simply opposed to government tyranny, whatever level of government it happens to be. Like, I don't particularly care what level of government is violating my rights, if it's local, federal, state. If my rights are being violated, I consider that to be problematic. Like, to hell with states' rights.
And freedom from government tyranny.
So the context in which Governor Wallace is speaking of tyranny is vastly different from the context in which libertarians speak of tyranny. You see, Governor Wallace was referring to the federal government preventing him from forcing segregation as tyranny because he thought that being a state governor gave him dictatorial power over all the businesses within the state. Libertarians, on the other hand, would consider George Wallace's infringement on the rights of private business owners to associate with whoever they want as the actual tyranny, and the federal government stepping in and preventing him from doing that as a curtailment of that tyranny. I don't think it's tyranny for the federal government to tell a state governor that they're not allowed to force segregation within their state. That's simply the federal government doing their job and making sure that state governments don't become tyrannical.
Sort of like old George Wallace. Senator Rand Paul and his friends on the libertarian right make sure that the values of old Dixie and an entrenched racial elite and racial inequality continue in the United States.
You really don't know a whole lot about Southern culture or history if you think that those are the only values that Old Dixie represents. See, not only is this video offensive to black people, because it makes it out as if they're a bunch of helpless children who need to suck on the tits of government, but it's also offensive to Southern people, because it implies that racism is the only thing that their culture and values are based upon.
Libertarianism truly is the velvet glove of a nice-sounding freedom policy. A glove that covers the iron fist of 500 years of genocide.
Actually, I'm pretty sure genocide is something that violates the non-aggression principle.
And apartheid in the United States. That covers the iron fist of white privilege.
You know, I'd really like to know more about this white privilege, because I hear left-wingers go on and on about it all the time, and, well, I'm white and I'm just not seeing it. I don't know, maybe since I'm white, I've grown somewhat used to the privilege, so from my perspective, it's not really there. Or maybe it's because I'm technically part Asian, I have a little bit of Asian in my DNA on my mom's side, so maybe there's a minimum threshold of whiteness that has to be in your DNA before the privilege kicks in. I don't know. All I'm saying is, I'm hearing about the white privilege, not really seeing it.
It covers the iron fist that to this day continues of discrimination and repression, of suppression of rights, of suppression of voting rights.
You gotta vote to keep up the illusion that the people are in control. You gotta vote for one of two narcissistic megalomaniacs with no soul.
Suppression of economic rights. Libertarianism is the velvet glove over the iron fist of racism.
You know, it's amazing. You are 100% wrong. I mean, nothing you've said has been right.
So let me just make this perfectly clear right now. There is nothing racist about libertarianism at all. It is probably like the least racist thing there is. We advocate for across-the-board fair treatment for everybody. That's what the non-aggression principle means. As a matter of fact, not only do we advocate for fair treatment across the board, and we're one of the only political ideologies that actually does this, you know, fair treatment across the board and not just for specific groups or using as political fodder, but whenever a government program or regulation disproportionately hurts minorities, we're the first to call it out. Like how the minimum wage mostly disemploys blacks more than whites, or how things like property taxes and gentrification keep blacks stuck in shitty neighborhoods. Social Security is essentially a black to white wealth transfer system. See, we libertarians have been calling out all of that, and all you progressives have been silent on it. Like, the extent to which you have to have your head up your ass to think libertarianism is racist is just mind-boggling. And I think Thom Hartmann, on a certain level, knows this. I think Thom Hartmann knows that there's nothing racist about libertarianism. I think what he's doing is he's using that typical left-wing strategy of trying to take everything that he disagrees with and twist it to make it seem racist.
I bet your butt is incredibly jealous of the crap that pours out of your mouth.
I know there's all these young people. Oh, I'm a libertarian. It sounds so cool. Yeah, just think about what it means, though.
Well, first of all, nice poisoning the well there. You know, making it out to be as if most libertarians are just a bunch of young people who only support it because it sounds cool. But then second of all, Tom, you should probably take your own advice there, because it's apparent to me that you really haven't spent any time thinking about what libertarianism actually means. Because you're honestly trying to argue that an ideology that says everyone deserves to be treated fairly and has individual rights is somehow racist. Like, I don't know whether he's just engaging in the typical left-wing tactic of labeling everything as racist, or if he genuinely actually believes that libertarianism is racist. Either way, though, this has to be like one of the most intellectually dishonest portrayals of libertarianism I've ever seen. Probably not as bad as the Newsbroke video, but definitely right up there with it. I mean, he makes the claim that libertarianism is racist, but doesn't really offer much in terms of an explanation. As a matter of fact, a lot of the explanations he does provide have nothing to do with libertarianism, like a lot of them involve shit mandated by the state. At the end of the day, though, the true velvet glove over the iron fist of racism is progressivism. Like almost everything progressives advocate for, screw over black people. Minimum wage, social security, gun control. Sometimes this is a side effect, other times it's by design. But the bottom line is that Thom Hartmann definitely doesn't have the high road when it comes to racism. Anyways, this has been Philosophossum making stupidity play dead. Happy Black History Month, everybody, and take care.